Hello and welcome to MEELive. I'm Matilda Mallinson. It's Thursday, the 5th of February. Today, how Epstein's shadow network shaped the Middle East and beyond. But first, we're bringing you an urgent story from our bureau chief for Palestine and Israel, Lubna Masarwa. The story of a family in the occupied West Bank forced by Israeli soldiers to choose between two sons. And the bigger story that their tragedy reveals of a suffocating occupation that is disappearing thousands of people into Israeli prisons where torture, rape, and murder are practiced with impunity. Palestinians abused in Israeli prisons are dying in unprecedented numbers due in part to medical neglect, and their bodies are not being returned to their families. At least 101 confirmed deaths since October 2023, the true figure likely to be far higher. This is happening where the world is not watching as the global media speaks of peace in Gaza. So here is the story of Ahmad, whose family were forced to hand him over in exchange for his innocent brother, on charges they were never told, for him to die of causes they do not believe, and his body to be held from them today.
خذوا أخوه وأخذوا أبوه حجزوهم الصبح فلتوهم قالوا بدنا إياه والله جبتوهوش بنسفه بقصفه شو عمل هو تعمل انك تقصفه شو ساوي 20 سنة ما لحكيش يعمل شيء ردوا أخذوا أخوه انحبس 4 أيام تا سلمناه تا راح أبوه سلموا على سالم تا روح هذاك الوسطاني وأنا اللي سلمته بإيدي أنا اللي سلمته للموت بإيدي
قعد 8 أشهر وعايش ولا اتصال ولا مرة اتصل علينا.
وقفنا له محامي زيارة دفعنا 700 شيكل مشان يزوروا زيارة كانت 9/8 زيارته واستشهد ب3/8 موتونا تصح لنا دور يزوروا.
أما أجا واحد من منطقة نابلس طلعنا فايتين بقمع الكلب كان ينساوي هون من بيت أكلنا إنه انضرب كمامي هون ضابطه صار عنده التهابات يعني أكل ما انطناش لا تقرير مثلا شو سبب موته طيب
نفس الشغل مطمنش كلب الواحد اذا ميت يدفنوا بيده ولا لا تعرف انه هذا قبر إله ما مش حاجزينه شو بدهم بيه ومات اذا ما بقولوا مات شو بدكم بيه حاجزينه خلص.
الطيب قاعدين بموتوا بيه والساغس قاعدين بقتلوا بيه يعني طلع السجين لي بكمية كيلو برجع 40 يعني مش هو الكل هيك.
الشهداء بس ناخذهم مش بس أنا من كل الإمايات لأنه كلبي مثل قلوبين أكيد.
دي أصعب من واحد يروح ابنه يعني بعد ابنه شو الواحد هو حياته.
MEE's bureau chief in Jerusalem, Lubna Masarwa, says she discovers stories like this every day. She says it's not a ceasefire she's reporting on so much as a slow genocide. And she's here with us today. Lubna, welcome to MEELive. It's a privilege to have you on, really. Watching that video back, the pain of the Tazaza family, it's heartbreaking just to watch. Can I ask, when you were recording this, what part of the interview affected you most?
I think this is one of the most tragic stories I covered in my career as a journalist. A parent, a mother, and a father that have to hand their youngest son to the army, and then for him to be killed in the prison. And to be in this grief, thinking that they could save him because the army threatened to strike the house, and also they held his brother, who is a father for 2 children. So the tears, the grief, the despair, and the guilt mostly, it's like a double tragedy for the family. But what mostly touched me were 2 things: to maybe see the father crying in silence. And for us, like, I'm used to see more women in Palestine crying, and seeing him crying was very touching for me. And also the children who were in the room that were listening to the story and crying as well. they miss their uncle. The children of the brother who were released also seem to feel guilt that they have their father back, but their uncle has been killed. And also when I visited the family of another prisoners who were killed, I asked the little boy, what do you want to be when you be older, when you be big boy? And his father said he sees his future ahead of him because his uncle was killed. And then this is like the moments where I wondered about the future of our children and this despair that really I couldn't describe.
This story alone is awful, but in reality, there are countless like it. How widespread are tragedies like this of Palestinians disappearing and dying in Israeli prisons? And what have you learned from people that you've met about what's happening in those prisons and how those people are dying?
Palestinian prisoners, especially in the past 2 years, or let's say since October 7, have been exposed to systematic torture and violence, starvation, and like the prisoners I met describe this. They said there's no word to describe the level of torture they exposed to. One of them told me, for example, when he was arrested in the first few days, he saw one prisoner counting rice seeds, and he counted 7 rice seeds and put in his bucket, and he didn't understand why. But with time, he learned about like the starvation as a tool of torture for the prisoners. The beating, the raids. There's another prisoner I interviewed for this report I made, young Palestinian man, also from area near Jenin, who says that when he asked for a medical treatment, he was shot before he was arrested in the exit of Jenin refugee camp. The doctor who seen him told him that you didn't come here for treating you, but for you to die. And the testimonies I heard from the prisoners in this past year, and I seen many prisoners, they describe horrifying cases and situations, the raids, the beating. One of them told me it's like a butchery place. One time, the guards entered the section and they beating them. He said the blood was in the wall, the blood was in the ground, and it's very systematic. And of course, it's like it's not by accident that they are being tortured and neglected from medical service. It's a policy, and this policy coming from high of the top, from Ben-Gvir and many other ministers. Ben-Gvir, the national security minister of Israel, himself take footage with the prisoners being in humiliated positions. He posted in social media, so it's a policy. And of course, Israel have, I would say, a full immunity that allows it to go to this level of horrific torture and neglection and violence and abuse that we also know and reported before about sexual abuse.
Is there a risk that the situation is going to get even worse? I mean, you talk about Ben-Gvir's influence over the conditions in prison. He is currently pushing through legislation to bring back the death penalty to Israeli prisons. Can you just tell us, specifically, how central is the role of Ben-Gvir and is his influence making the situation you're talking about worse and worse?
During Ben-Gvir position, or since Ben-Gvir became minister, 101 Palestinian prisoners were killed and died in the Israeli prisons. And this is a big number if we compare to all the other years before. I think there's a bill now in the Knesset that passing first and second steps to allow the execution. And of course, Ben-Gvir says that there were about 100 Israeli doctors who volunteered to make the execution. But in fact, even if it's legalized and if it's a formal law or not, the execution is happening. The message that the Israelis are receiving in the prison that you can kill them to death, and they do. They're killing them, and there is no charges, there is no investigation, there is nobody care about, they just know that they can kill Palestinian prisoners, and there is no charge. So there is the execution law is giving a platform for the Israeli security forces to commit such a level of violence that gets you to death in the Israeli system.
But as you're saying, even before this bill has been passed into law, the executions are happening. Lubna,
Israel now is like a jungle. There is no restrictions. There's no restrictions for killing Palestinians. There are no restrictions for terrorizing Palestinians in the West Bank. There's no restrictions of anything. Israel now, like no man's land. They're doing everything they want. There is no international law. We know that it's collapsed totally, and we witnessed the genocide and how it was normalized. And this is giving Israel such a green light to commit this crimes that we didn't expect it will get to this level in this time.
Something I learned from your reporting on this, Lubna, as well, is that the bodies of many Palestinians are being withheld by Israeli forces, at least 776, according to the rights group Al-Quds Legal Aid and Rights Centre. That includes, or there's an additional 10 foreign citizens, and it includes at least 88 people who died in Israeli custody. Now, when reading this, I found myself reflecting on the massive diplomatic and media efforts that we've all seen to have the bodies of the Israeli hostages returned by Hamas, right up until last week when the body of the final hostage, Ran Gvil, was returned. Now, there were massive international rescue efforts to see those bodies returned. The world knows how important that is for families. So reading in your reports that hundreds of Palestinians' bodies are being withheld from their families by Israel's army and prison service, I can't help but wonder, where is the global outrage about this?
There is no global outrage, and our pain is not equal as the pain of the Israelis. Releasing the body of Ran Goeli, I listened to the speech of Herzog, the president of the Israeli state, and he said, like, finally, the pieces of our heart can come together and heal. And the mother of Ahmed can't even see the body or her son and to say goodbye to him. So there's a complete gap. To release the body of Ron Goeli from Al-Bach cemetery in Gaza came in the price of bulldozing a whole cemetery of 200 Palestinian bodies who were all over the place. And in Islam, the respect of the body, the respect of the death, is something very high and very valuable. That's why we bury very quickly and we don't wait. So there's a policy of revenge, of holding the Palestinian bodies and keeping the Palestinian mothers and fathers and families in endless grief that they even can't close this cycle. But when it's come to an Israeli hostage, an Israeli body, it's become emotional and feeling, and the mother and the sister and prime minister made a very touching speech in his funeral, the same the president. And this is I think the painful part of our tragedy as a Palestinian, that our pain is not equal. It's not equal.
Lubna,
The bodies are kept. Over 100,000 Palestinian prisoners being tortured, beaten every day. No one speak about them. Almost half of them, by the way, have administrative detention, which is mean no trial, no charge, and you can't see a lawyer. They even don't know why they are in prison.
Lubna, just before we lose you, I would love to hear how you're doing. This, of course, is not just an environment in which you are reporting, it's an environment in which you're living. How are you?
You know, I don't know how to address this question. I don't think it's about me and how I feel. I feel this is a duty to bring the stories of my people, at least that I can do. I told you before earlier today, I want to be even like a doormat, a platform for my people to tell their stories and to bring their pain and their suffering. And for me to sit in front of Ahmad Najah and her and his father and be there, allowing her to tell her story and to cry. This is like the at least we can do as journalists and as Palestinians.
Lubna, Masarwa, thank you so much for making time for us today.
Thank you.
The Israeli Prison Service did not respond to MEE's request for comment on the matters raised in Lubna's report. We'll move on now to our next story on the Epstein files, but we would like to ask one thing of you. As the Gaza ceasefire looks to progress to phase 2 and the headlines emit from Trump's Board of Peace, our reporting does not tell a story of peace. It tells a story of occupation and of a genocide continuing behind bars. We need to get these stories heard, so please go to middleeasteye.net to read about the underreported reality and share these stories with your networks to make sure they don't get buried. Thank you. 3.5 million pages, 180,000 images, 2,000 videos. The latest round of the Epstein files was released by the US Department of Justice last week.
Breaking tonight, the Justice Department releasing more than 3 million pages of documents related to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. President Trump's name referenced hundreds of times.
I haven't spoken to him in probably 15 years or more.
In and amongst the more than 180,000 images released are these pictures showing the then Prince Andrew kneeling over and touching a female whose identity has been hidden.
I was 14 years old.
I was 16 years old.
I was 16.
17.
14 years old.
Court filings, Gouffre says that Maxwell recruited her while she was working as a locker room attendant and was groomed to be a sex slave to Epstein, adding she was later directed by Maxwell and Epstein to have sex with many, quote, powerful men, including numerous prominent American politicians, powerful business executives, foreign presidents, and other world leaders.
But I don't understand why the Jeffrey Epstein case would be of interest to anybody. It's pretty boring stuff. It's short.
The US Justice Department said this was the final batch of material that would be published.
We didn't protect or not protect anybody. I mean, I think that there's a hunger or a thirst for information that I do not think will be satisfied by the review of these documents.
I think that the release right now is being sold as transparency, and it is not transparent at all. I think it 100% protects the perpetrator.
Do you think you're the devil himself?
No, but I do have a good mirror.
It's a serious question. Do you think you're the devil himself?
I don't know. Why would you say that?
Because you have all the attributes. You're incredibly smart. You remember, the devil is somebody knows.
Smart?
The devil's brilliant. You read Milton's Paradise Lost.
No, the devil scares me.
If you stack up the latest release of files, you'd have 2 Eiffel Towers worth of paper, according to the US Deputy Attorney General. CBS News puts it at 3 Statues of Liberty. But the quantity of material does not change its lateness. The release comes 6 weeks after a deadline that was signed into law by US President Donald Trump. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche said that the extra time was needed to make redactions and protect survivors' identities. Defending the release, he revealed some of the most severe content was excluded.
Any depiction of CSAM or child pornography was obviously excluded. Anything that would jeopardize an active federal investigation. And finally, anything that depicts or contain images of death, physical abuse, or injury, also not produced.
The severity and the number of these redactions, as well as the millions of files still withheld from release, have intensified accusations that the US administration is attempting a cover-up to defend President Trump. The DOJ denies this. Meanwhile, survivors of Epstein's abuse point out serious errors in the redactions, with images and footage exposing young women's faces, naked bodies, and names. The survivors released a statement saying that they are exposed, while, quote, the men who abused us remain hidden and protected. Despite extensive redactions, the files do shed light over the extent and elite nature of Epstein's global power network, with emails and documents dating back more than a decade. If you search Trump in the DOJ's Epstein library, you get 5,176 results. That's more than 38,000 mentions of his name. Yet none of them prove any wrongdoing by the US president, who once called the paedophile a terrific guy, but claims they fell out before he was ever convicted. For some, it's an anticlimax following months of MAGA infighting over the release of the files. Right-wing conspiracy theorists who form a relevant part of Trump's voting base have accused successive governments of a cover-up and rejected the FBI's conclusion that Epstein died by suicide while in jail. While Trump has not been incriminated by the latest releases, a spreadsheet the DOJ says it accidentally released included graphic descriptions of alleged abuse submitted as unverified tips to the FBI. But these are unsubstantiated claims, and the DOJ has since removed the file. So where has this all left the US president, MAGA, and the Republicans? How did Epstein's political corruption interact with his sexual criminality? And what new conclusions can we categorically draw from this latest influx of files? We're joined now by MEE's US correspondent, Sean Matthews. Sean, welcome back to MEELive. The first question on everyone's mind, please can you just tell us, was Jeffrey Epstein a spy?
I think we can definitively say that he had a lot of connections with spies, a very good one with a former spy who became the prime minister of Israel, Ehud Barak. And he did a lot of things that potentially not spies, but that assets of spies or agents of spies would do. And I think this last tranche of documents that we got, 3 million documents, it really crystallized Epstein's deep interest in intelligence work, both corporate and political, right? But he very much had the tendencies of someone you would call an asset in the spycraft trade.
And from the perspective of those who thought this evidence was going to come out and be really damning about Trump in the US, many are saying the Epstein files are a little bit underwhelming. There's no definitive evidence of wrongdoing by the president. Is Trump about to see the end of this whole fiasco?
No, I mean, it's funny, Matilda, because that's the argument that Trump is making, right? I mean, it's always about Trump for Trump. So he's saying, my name isn't, named in these files in a way that shows that I've done anything wrong. There's no smoking gun for me. And in a sense, he's correct, right? There is no smoking gun that shows him emailing Epstein about going to his island or something like that. But I think for us, admittedly, for our listeners and to our readers, the tranche of documents that was released is much more fascinating than a Trump smoking gun, because it shows that Epstein was very much plugged into this elite power world of businessmen, of heads of state, a lot of them in the Middle East, especially so in the Middle East, I think we can say. So the Trump, the kind of the Trump smoking gun wasn't there, but the documents themselves are endlessly fascinating. And it's really an expose on how money and diplomats and world leaders and politicians work with men like Jeffrey Epstein.
Do you think that there's a chance we could see more files released? I know that the Deputy Attorney General signaled this wouldn't be the case, but there is a bipartisan push to force them to reveal more. Is there a public appetite for more? Do you think we could see more?
Look, for sure there's a public appetite. I mean, I think so. These documents that we have now that came out, they came out as part of the Epstein Files Transparency Act, which basically was passed back in November 2025. And really, there are a handful of lawmakers who listeners have to thank for that. One is Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna. The other is Republican Thomas Massie. Former Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene was a big advocate of this. So there were some very strong advocates. Also, Alexandria Cortez, the Democratic Congresswoman. So on the left and the right, where there were some strong advocates in favor of getting these documents out. And that's the kind of pressure that had to get through Congress, and Trump had to sign it, right? So that's where we have these documents. I think the pressure could build for more documents. There are definitely more out there. And I think these documents leave many more questions than they do answers, right? I should note that one very interesting thread that I have seen in some of the reporting out there is the fact that Jeffrey Epstein actually sent a Freedom of Information Act request back in 1999 to the Central Intelligence Agency, trying to find out if they had any records on him. So that file number, the two file numbers that Epstein had requested about himself, that he listed, at least the two file numbers with the CIA, they're now stated publicly. So I think there's a push underway by a lot of people to do a Freedom of Information Act request and try to get those files that were referenced by the Epstein request going back to 1999. So yeah, this is not the end of the story, right? This is just one case of it that this is going to keep percolating.
Now, as you point out, there is a lot of information about the political spheres in which Epstein operated coming from this latest release. And we will be really diving into the details of that after this with Murtaza Hussain from DropSite News. But look, this man was convicted for child sex crimes and he died charged with serial rape and human trafficking. How did Jeffrey Epstein's political meddling interact with his criminal life as a trafficker and child molester?
Yeah, well, look, Matilda, I mean, Lubna mentioned, I think, one TV show, Nomadland, during her segment. And in our reporting, what we have said is that this tranche of documents that we see really kind of puts Epstein into the world of somebody like Richard Angelo Roper in The Night Manager, another TV show. I think that's the best comparison, where you have Epstein, on one hand, he's a businessman of some sorts, trying to take information from leaders in the UK about the bailout of the Eurozone. He's parlaying favors back and forth, and he's also arranging meetings between officials in the Gulf, former Gulf officials and former Israeli officials. He's talking with the head of DP World, Dubai Ports World, about sexual activities with women. I mean, it's a horrendous, kind of indictment of the ruling class in the Middle East and in the U.S. for all to see. But again, I think what we're seeing is kind of this network effect. And basically what we see is that Epstein, sometimes he's partying with friends who are senior officials or business people. Other times he's parlaying that to cut deals, right? There's been some reporting out there, which I'm sure you'll get into, that Epstein was integral in a deal between Mongolia and Israel, a security agreement. So yes, he's very much in this world of connections and favors and networking, and he's bending the right. He's speaking with former presidents, Bill Clinton. He's mentioning Trump a lot in the emails. So he's speaking with former officials, and he's also speaking with spy masters. I mean, Ehud Barak, don't forget this, before he was prime minister of Israel, he was head of the Israeli military intelligence for the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli military. So, I mean, yes, very much, Epstein was at the center of this network, and he used basically this sexual molestation, the sexual assaults, the raping of young girls, minors, to entice business people and potentially world leaders, heads of state, into his network. And he parlayed that for favors and information, very much as an intelligence asset would do.
Can we expect from that to see any criminal investigations, any prosecutions? I mean, already here in the UK, we've seen Lord Mandelson, who was the former US ambassador and until very recently a Labour peer. We've seen a criminal investigation just opened up into him in the last days. Do you think that there will be a round of legal prosecutions, of actual accountability coming from this?
I mean, I personally hope there will be, and I think a lot of our listeners potentially hope there will be. Unfortunately, I think what you're hitting the nail on the head here, Matilda, is a vast difference in the way that money and politics function in the United States compared to the UK. And I've heard this drawn a lot, right? Not to say that the UK is the model for everything, but at least in the UK, you have Mendelsohn, right, facing some kind of public scrutiny, and now these calls are coming. In the US from Democratic leaders, from Republican leaders, we don't hear that at all. From a very few, we do hear it, from the Thomas Masses of the world and from the Ro Khannas. But other than those kind of a select group of officials and lawmakers, we don't hear much of a call. What we hear is basically everyone wants to sweep this under the rug. So I think it really is on the public to demand more files, to request files like the CIA files that Epstein wrote, right, with his Freedom of Information Act request. We need to see more of that from the public to try to get more answers and kind of build, I think, a pressure campaign.
I mean, one person definitely trying to sweep this under the rug is Donald Trump. He's been very dismissive of this story, actually criticizing media like Middle East Eye, media that are continuing to talk about the Epstein files, calling it a hoax. Trump has called it pretty boring stuff. What would you say in response to that? I mean, how important are the Epstein files really?
I mean, I think before we discuss how boring or fascinating they are, we have to recognize that, and most of these emails, Epstein is talking about the abuse of underage women, the rape, the trafficking of them. So at the first level, they're horrendous and they're horrific. When you look past that, as people in the industry who are trying to track politics and money and power, I mean, they're absolutely fascinating. And, the level of access that Epstein had in the Gulf region, especially the fact that he was watching, for example, the failed coup in Turkey, and he appeared to allege that Russia had tipped President Erdogan off about this coup. The fact that he was watching the 2017 blockade of Qatar by the UAE and Saudi Arabia, that he was trying to broker meetings between the Gulf states, that he was talking about Palantir, a U.S. defense tech company, with Ehud Barak, the former prime minister of Israel, and they were drastically misspelling the word Palantir multiple times. I think it's fascinating. So it is not a boring story. The numbers bear that out in terms of, I think, our readership that is coming to Middle East Eye to get all the snippets and details from these emails and see our take on them in our analysis as we kind of pluck out the strands from the thousands and thousands of emails that Epstein sent. So it's definitely not a boring story, and it's not going away.
Sean Matthews, thank you so much for joining us on MEELive.
Thank you.
Now, Jeffrey Epstein, the American financier, died in a New York prison cell in 2019, awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges. He died accused as a serial rapist, child molester, and human trafficker who was friends with some of the most powerful people in the world: Mick Jagger, Woody Allen, Kevin Spacey, Elon Musk, Bill Clinton. But some of the most powerful people listed in the Epstein files are people you've probably never heard of. Arms dealers, CEOs, spies, and state leaders for whom Epstein appears to have worked as a private and unofficial diplomat. It paints a shadowy picture of a global elite making geopolitical decisions outside of due process. Many of these same elites attended Epstein's island, where unknown numbers of women and girls were coerced to have sex with powerful guests, for which there has only been one prosecution: the prosecution of a woman, Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's long-term romantic associate, now serving 20 years in prison for helping him recruit women and children to abuse. Ghislaine is the daughter of Robert Maxwell, widely believed to have worked for Israel's intelligence agency Mossad, with additional links to MI6 and the KGB. Maxwell's close ties to Epstein have fueled rumors that the disgraced financier was himself embroiled in Israeli espionage. The latest files do reveal Epstein was intricately involved in regional politics. But to find out just how involved, I spoke earlier to Murtaza Hussain, an investigative journalist at DropSite News, who has trawled through the Epstein files to understand his undue influence on Middle Eastern politics specifically, and how it continues to play out today. So your investigation connects Jeffrey Epstein to some pretty major and pretty murky arms deals, namely the Iran-Contra affair in the 1980s, when US President Ronald Reagan and the CIA illegally sold arms to Iran during its war with Iraq, and they used Israel as an intermediary. How deep were Epstein's ties to arms dealers, and how incriminating are your discoveries?
Yeah, in many ways, the story of Epstein really begins with Iran-Contra and his deep connections with the many major figures involved in that scandal, including Adnan Khashoggi, John Stanley Pottinger, and many other individuals who were very much at the core of Iran-Contra. Now, Epstein himself, he was fresh out of Wall Street around that time in the 1980s, but he had deep ties with the people in the arms trafficking world, including Douglas Leese, a British arms trafficker, also said to be involved in Iran-Contra. But one very notable detail that we uncovered in our story, included in the story, was that for people who don't know, Iran-Contra entailed the smuggling of weapons to Iran, and also weapons to Nicaragua as well too, and also drugs in the Western Hemisphere as well, using this fleet of planes from an airline called the Southern Air Transport. Now, Southern Air Transport, after Iran-Contra became public, it tried to go under the radar a bit and rebrand itself. And one of the things that happened was actually Southern Air Transport's planes were transferred to facilitate the logistics enterprise for something called Limited Brands. And Limited Brands is the major corporation that owns Victoria's Secret and Abercrombie and Fitch and so forth. And around that time, Jeffrey Epstein became the power of attorney over the entire limited brand's fortune. He got that from an individual named Les Wexner, who was the founder of the company. And then when the planes were discovered from Southern Air Transport, they were actually given to limited brands and moved to Ohio to service its retail empire. So these Iran-Contra planes, Jeffrey Epstein was actually the person who arranged for them to be moved there. And he switched the planes from smuggling drugs, smuggling weapons, to smuggling, to transporting clothing for these brands like Victoria's Secret and Abercrombie & Fitch. So I know it's kind of a complicated little web there, but effectively the Iran-Contra planes, the person who took charge of them was Jeffrey Epstein himself. And that history has never really been reported or noted in any of the broader story of how he became rich and how he became embedded in this world of intelligence operations. But really, it does go back to the 1980s and this maelstrom of Iran-Contra, where all this illicit activity is taking place and a lot of money is being made through the smuggling.
Something you also paint there with that very sort of complicated network is how Epstein manages to bring together sort of arms dealers and multinational CEOs in ways that aren't generally understood by the public. You mentioned Les Wexner, right? He runs the Wexner Foundation. He owns the Wexner Foundation. This is one of the largest contributors to pro-Israel causes in the US. It's a philanthropic body funded by this billionaire fashion tycoon who, as you say, his empire once included the sort of Victoria's Secret branches of the world. What have your files revealed about Epstein's involvement in this group and in the wider lobbying within US that pro-Israel bodies have managed to achieve?
So Epstein was someone very adept at using nonprofit entities to obtain political benefit, perhaps to also entail covert activities and so forth, whose funding and operations was often concealed through these opaque financial mechanisms, and also the nonprofit organizations which helped arrange diplomacy in some of the stories that we've written about. But his tie to the Wexner Foundation is very interesting because the Wexner empire included limited brands, but also included these philanthropic entities with huge budgets and so forth. And the Wexner Foundation is one of these. It's a major funder of pro-Israel activities in the United States. It funds or funded fellowships for Israeli public officials to study at places like Harvard and so forth in the United States to kind of embed these networks very closely. They footed the bill for all that. And after Epstein's, criminal activities came to light and he passed away in jail, they effectively tried to distance themselves from him in public. But what our reporting shows, based on his own emails, is that Epstein was really like the shot caller inside this foundation. He was in many ways treated as the last person with the highest say over the disbursement of funds, over funding opportunities and so forth. So it really wasn't Wexner himself, despite the foundation bearing his name. It was really Epstein who actually was in charge of this. So I would think that would make Epstein, you could say he was the most powerful person, one of the most powerful pro-Israel lobbying organizations, or not lobbying, pro-Israel activist organization in some ways in the United States. He was the one person with the authority over the purse strings of this very powerful institution. And again, it was through his being assigned this fortune by Les Wexner in the 1990s. He was basically given power of attorney of this massive empire. And one can imagine what if, Epstein was not anyone of any public note at that time. Can someone imagine Elon Musk giving power of attorney over their entire fortune, or Bill Gates giving power of attorney over their entire fortune to some relatively obscure figure in their personal network at some time? It was kind of on that level almost. It was a bit of a bizarre thing.
Another episode you uncover that sort of paints this picture of Epstein as a key figure in Israeli diplomacy inside the US was his involvement in a coordinated smear campaign against the political scientists John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, who published a paper in 2006 about Israeli lobbyists shaping US foreign policy. Quickly just tell us what this paper found and how Epstein got involved in the response.
So this paper was the basis of a very famous book in the early 2000s called The Israel Lobby in U.S. Foreign Policy, written by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt. And the paper was like the introduction to that book, basically, or the thesis of the book was that paper. And it was published at Harvard. And there was tremendous controversy over its publication because it was critical of the U.S.-Israel relationship. And one thing that was not known was that one of the people who helped engineer the controversy or helped ban it in some way, you could say, was Jeffrey Epstein. Now, Jeffrey Epstein at the time was a very powerful, influential figure at Harvard. He had an office at Harvard, and he reviewed early drafts of basically a takedown of this paper written by Alan Dershowitz, who was also his attorney, which basically characterized it anti-Semitic, which made very strong personal accusations about Walter Mearsheimer. He was ideologically invested in attacking critics of Israel and helping people like Dershowitz undermine the personal reputations of individuals who at that time would dare to be critical of Israel in a public forum.
Now, long before the latest release of the Epstein files, there was speculation about Epstein's links to Israeli intelligence. This was due in large part to his ties to Robert Maxwell, the father of his girlfriend Ghislaine Maxwell, and a widely alleged Mossad agent or asset. But now there's a very clear picture emerging of Epstein's close ties to the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak. The total Epstein library includes over 4,000 mentions of Barak, and in one audio recording, Epstein advises him on working with Palantir. Palantir is the American tech company working with ICE and run by Trump donor Peter Thiel. Murtaza, talk us through Epstein's role in helping Israel or Barak develop these surveillance military state models, such as that used in the Gaza genocide.
So, Barak's ties with Epstein were something that was known at a high level, but the granular details actually come to us first. It came to DropSite through a leaked archive of Barak's emails in the early 2010s, showing thousands of messages between him and Epstein. And these messages show that they weren't just like friends. They had a very close personal relationship, which extended to political intelligence, diplomatic activities that Epstein actually was the one helping Barak with all this. And really, it's one of the very interesting things about this whole saga is that, at this time, Barak was defense minister of Israel. For part of the time, he was a former prime minister. You could say at that time, he was really one of the most influential people in the Israeli political and security establishments. But he really looked up to Epstein. The power dynamic was really in Epstein's favor in their communications. And Barak was trying to get Epstein's help to help him arrange back-channel diplomacy between Israel and some African countries, in Russia, over the Syria conflict as well. He was really looking at Epstein as a more powerful figure in this case. So, when what Barak was doing in 2013, he left public life formally, although he continued to work on behalf of Israel in his capacity as an influential private citizen tied to the intelligence establishment. But when he left the defense ministry, he really wanted Epstein's help to do two things: to help him make money as a private citizen, but also to help spread this growing boom in Israeli surveillance technology and help pitch it to foreign countries to embed it in their infrastructure. And it's kind of funny because, Epstein, his home was being used as de facto like an embassy to organize high-level diplomacy between heads of state and foreign government officials a lot of the time. It really makes you wonder, how did this one individual who was really just a private citizen, on paper at least, become so powerful? But really, he was very integral to making Barak very wealthy, making the Israeli surveillance sector so well-funded, and also spreading his growth around the world, while also relaying the groundwork for formal security arrangements that Israel signed with governments in Cote d'Ivoire, Mongolia, and other places we're going to write about in the future.
And his work with the Israeli government seems to have gone much further than that. Tell us, what have you uncovered about Epstein's unofficial diplomacy between Israel and the UAE before the two countries officially signed the Abraham Accords in 2020?
Well, in the early 2000s, this is very going far back now, 2006, the UAE got in a lot of trouble because it tried to expand its Dubai Ports World empire to the United States. At the time, it was the Iraq War was going on. There was a lot of suspicion, hostility towards a Middle Eastern country, any country, owning American critical infrastructure. And they had to back down the deal and so forth. So it's kind of a very... it just shook up Emirati elites, basically, that whole episode. So one of the individuals that they seems from this correspondence to have turned to, the head of Dubai Ports World turned to, was Jeffrey Epstein. And he built a very close personal relationship with Epstein over the course of, basically up to Epstein's death. He was a frequent visitor to his island. Epstein helped him get medical services for him and his family in Israel. He helped set up meetings between Barak and senior global banking officials at JP Morgan and elsewhere with this gentleman whose name was Sultan Saleem, the head of Dubai Ports World. And one very funny thing is that Epstein, before he died, he used to brag about his relationship with Saleem. He said that he was so close with him that he basically ran Dubai Ports World's port at Berbera in the territory of Somaliland. And we never really had any evidence that was true until now. The emails actually did show you had a very close relationship, a very overly intimate relationship in some ways. They would talk about their sexual dalliances and so forth in very vulgar details amongst one another. They were so close that this is really part of their relationship. And, Sultan Saleem is still a very important, influential figure in the UAE. He's still at the head of Dubai Ports World and so forth. And he's never really, as far as I'm aware, addressed this close relationship with Epstein. But his relationship with Epstein and Epstein's relationship with other Emirati elites was really the background to the Abraham Accords, which was signed a year after Epstein's death in prison. He had built up the trust interpersonally between all these individuals over a very long period of time. Again, as I said, in a very intimate way, that made it very easy for them to finally come out of the closet, so to speak, in 2020 when they signed the formal agreement. And now they're collaborating in many ways, including on Somaliland, which was a place that Epstein himself was very closely involved.
Murtaza, I'm interested. DropSite has done really detailed work joining the dots and trying to pick out the most relevant inferences about, who has been up to what in negotiating the world order. And other outlets have not been so bold in coming to those conclusions. DropSite criticizes the New York Times, for example, for refraining from joining the dots that you did on the Iran-Contra affair. How do you feel that the mainstream media has covered the Epstein files overall?
Well, it's funny because the New York Times and other places, they do cover Epstein per se. They talk about him almost every day in some cases. They're publishing op-eds and stories about him. But it seems like they're trying to actually avoid the political and intelligence aspects of his activities, which I think as we've shown, they're a very, very huge and integral part of understanding of who he was and what he was up to, in fact, and the significant role he played in not just American politics, but global politics. So, one defense that there could have been made before that people did tend to raise is that, well, our stories at DropSite are based on this hacked email archives from Barak and Epstein. And, they said, well, we did a lot to verify them, but they said, well, we can't verify them for that reason, or who knows the veracity, or, we don't want to ethically engage with hacked material. Like these kind of attempts to justify not engaging with it. That excuse, as in my view, is very weak as it was. That's been totally obliterated now because the emails that we've written about, many of them have been released by the government now in their archives. They're double confirmed by multiple Epstein file releases by the DOJ and the U.S. Department of Justice and also the House Oversight Committee in the U.S. So there's no doubt at all the emails are real now. So if you're still not covering it, then you're deliberately ignoring something is real. And I think that's kind of the question. Now, I do think there are strong political reasons for them not to do it. They don't like the story. They don't feel comfortable covering Israel's activities in the United States, intelligence activities and so forth generally. They're just trying to pretend it's not happening because the view that they have is that if we start acknowledging it, then it becomes real. And if everyone else is talking about, well, we're not, then we haven't entered into the historical record. But I think that conceit will be harder and harder to maintain because the story is resonating with a lot of people because it's very well reported. It's true. And it's touching on something everyone knows is real, which is Epstein was a very important intelligence figure tied to Israel, tied to America, tied to other countries. And the story they're telling in the public that he was just a very rich guy who was a sexual abuser, which is part of the story, is not the whole story. It's actually leaving out perhaps the most important aspect of understanding who it is. And, just to cap that off, there's a term of art used in the intelligence world called a limited hangout. A limited hangout is when something is true and it's really bad and the public's learning about it, but you need to satiate their desire to know about it. So you talk about only a certain aspect of it, but you talk about that aspect a lot. And then you leave out the other aspects you want to hide and hope that people are satisfied that they've heard the whole story because of what you have talked about. And hopefully the rest of the story has just died, be forgotten, or only bring it up decades later when it doesn't matter anymore. That's what they're trying to do, in my view. There's an attempt to do a limited hangout with Epstein and focusing only on one part of the story and leaving out the rest.
Your investigations, it paints a pretty sinister picture of the way that power is brokered in this world. But do any of these allegations criminally implicate those named in your reporting? Or maybe my final question is that the point?
Well, there are certain things like the violation of domestic arms control exports and intelligence exports that really are potential violations of laws or regulations in countries where people who knew Epstein were operating. So you're really talking about the laws of Epstein dealt with people in, all over Africa and Israel, in the Middle East and so forth. They could have been violating Israeli laws or African laws. I think that there's evidence to think that they were concerned about that in the communications. But I think that more than that, though, it is a story of impunity. This was a group of people around the world, this certain strata, a small slice of a global society, the Davos set, you could say, who really seemed to believe that they were above laws and morality and all those things. Those things are just for the ordinary people, so to speak. And they behaved in a way that they didn't really even consider it to be relevant per se. And I think the sex trafficking and the sex abuse really was part and parcel of that. Because if one were at this class and started feeling that they were had so much impunity and that they were almost akin to gods, so to speak, then you would engage perhaps in this moral transgression, more and more extreme levels of moral transgression, legal transgression, not just in the state, money laundering and things like that, but, this sex abuse and so forth, that's very much seems to be part of it. So I do think that, power, when not scrutinized and when not put under public attention, it tends to act very badly. People act very badly. And that's why we tend to hope that power is embodied in democratic institutions that we all have some insight and transparency into. But when it's these other sort of institutions, which are not really institutions, but networks, opaque networks of people who are more powerful than our government, it seems, and more influential than them, or even exert control over them in these ways, inevitably, they will use their opacity and their freedom from oversight. Human nature suggests to engage in this very, very bad behavior, which seemed to, in this case, plumb the worst depths of human depravity in many cases. So, yeah, I think that's kind of the story. It's a story of impunity more than law breaking, although many laws are certainly broken.
Murtaza Hussain, thank you so much for your time here today and for your extremely thorough reporting. If anyone would like to read the full stories, they are online at DropSite News. That was Murtaza Hussain, journalist at DropSite News. And for today, that is all that we have time for. But before we lose you, we would love to hear from you. Please send in your thoughts and questions to @MiddleEastEye on any social platform or email MEELive@middleeasteye.net. We'll be here at 5 p.m. GMT, noon in New York, every Tuesday and Thursday. See you then.